Welcome back to another virtual tasting. We're going to be talking about gin tonight and how to taste it and how to build some more interesting gin cocktails with the help of our friend Jake. Our friend Dan is here as well to ask weird questions about gin. And I am Pat from the Whiskey Hotline, joined by Brett as always. So we do have a lot of things to taste and talk about tonight. So let's get started. Jake has lovely slides for us as always.
Good evening, everyone. So tonight is going to be kind of a culmination of a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. We're going to talk about different types of aromatized wines. We're going to talk about the tongue map. But this is some things I've thought about over the years of just taking a look at the what is now a much wider world of gin and saying, trying to get a sense of how to make simple drinks with all these different kinds of gins. And so, of course, we're going to focus on Hayman's gins because Hayman's gins are what I represent, and because they make great traditional gins. But we'll also talk about some modern gins that our friends at Binny's have selected. First, a warning, that's John Bartlett, the Bartlett of Bartlett's Book of Familiar Quotations. We are going to talk about taste tonight. You may very well disagree with much or all of what I'm saying about how things taste or how I like to combine flavors. I think the processes and the techniques we'll talk about tonight are still going to be helpful for you, even if you don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions. So there is no disputing taste, as Bartlett compiled. He called it a proverb in Bartlett's Book of Familiar Quotations. If you remember these from Aromatized number 3, the Botanical Bonanza presentation, the tongue map. We are going to be using that material tonight. If not, after tonight, or if you're watching on YouTube later, go over to Binny's YouTube page and take a look at the last little part of Aromatized number 3. You'll get some of the lingo that we're talking about tonight. In a quick nutshell, basically the idea is that different flavors stimulate different parts of your tongue from front to back, and that you can think about balancing cocktails by balancing those stimulations across your tongue. That's a gross oversimplification, but hopefully some of the examples that we do tonight will help illustrate it.
So, Jake, why would a tongue the size of that frog's not be effective for tasting gin?
The tongues, some animals' tongues extend a lot. I suspect if he was tasting gin, his mouth would be closed. Although, the all-important sprinkle tasting technique I hear is common in the frog community.
Yeah, okay.
In the beginning, that line is not written in any book, but we might as well roll with it. Listed there is the commonly accepted original definition for the Martini cocktail, back when cocktails were phrased in terms of proportions or fractions. Half dry gin, half French, which meant dry vermouth, and orange bitters. In fact, that is what I am enjoying tonight. One of the mixtures that we'll talk about tonight. I'm just having it down on the rocks because, we drink at home, and the less ceremony required, the better. Today, though, things are a little more complicated. I did some quick calculation earlier. Binny's in Marcy Street has more than 290 gins and aquavits, more than 100 aromatized wines, and 113 different bitters. So it's a little bit more than just dry gin, dry vermouth, and orange bitters. And so one of the things we want to take a look at tonight is trying to get a sense for each of us of how to think about what goes with what. Of course, in the world of aromatized wines, we're mainly talking about 3 major botanicals: wormwood, gentian, and quinine. Go back to episode 2 of this series if you want to hear a lot more about this stuff, episode 1 and episode 2. But the 3 main types of aromatized wines we'll talk about are vermouth, wine bittered with wormwood; Americano, wine bittered with gentian; and quinquina, wine bittered with quinine. The characteristics we'll be looking at are both what those bitter elements are, but also the level of sugar in each of those styles of aromatized wines. Or in the case of sugar level, where they come from. So like we talked about before, Italian things tend to be sweeter than French things. For more on aromatized wines, take a look again, go back to the YouTube channel, Vermouth 101, Vermouth 202, and the third volume as well. And of course, our website at alpens.com has plenty of category info as well as product info. All right, this is the first of what will be 2 eye charts in this in this presentation tonight. On the top is what we call the gin family tree. And that is just a sense of what are all the different categories or super categories, if you will, of gin that we see in history. We're not going to talk about all of them tonight. As much as I love Genever is not part of this tonight.
And Jake, to let you know, Danny Shapiro, who is the owner and founder of Scofflaw, which is Chicago's first gin cocktail bar, has just joined us. So
good evening,
go ahead.
Danny.
Thanks for joining, Danny.
Muted. That's muted, Danny.
Thanks for having me.
Danny, we have to stop meeting like this. I really hope the next time that we meet up, there'll be actual beverages in the same location.
Sure.
So yeah, the gin family tree here, a very classic way of looking at different styles of gins. But tonight we're going to break things down in a little more systematic way based on taste. We're going to talk about juniper gins, sort of what we think of as normal juniper dry gin, London Dry or Plymouth style, Old Tom gin, and we've got not just the Old Tom gin that I represent, but Danny's bar's Old Tom, Navy gin, Navy style gin, high juniper, high proof, but then also the world of modern gins. And I look at modern gins kind of in a few different buckets. They're the delicate ones that aren't super junipery, but also aren't super astringent, that have this nice roundness and nice delicacy to them, but then also ones that are sort of intentionally not super balanced, that have maybe even almost an astringency to them. Those are sometimes trickier to drink by themselves, but often really shine with tonic or in specific types of cocktails. And a lot of times when people ask me about how to pair a gin with an aromatized wine, it's one of these types of gins that they're asking about. Wooded gin, this is a thing that we certainly see out there. People like brown stuff, we hear. That said, some of them are really tasty, but you still have to account for the wood when you mix with them. And then Pat Brophy's personal favorite, Aquavit, which is a related category of spirits that are botanical distillates but aren't generally driven by juniper. We're going to talk about one tonight and also talk about one of my favorite sort of fundamental cocktails, which is an Aquavit cocktail. So these colors are going to come back during the course of the presentation. So hopefully that'll help you kind of keep tabs of where we are.
Jake, we got our first question here. Jan asks if, based on your chart here, how would you categorize no-lets, which would be...
So no-lets I find to be an intense floral gin, but intense floral and herbal gin. It works occasionally in modern drinks. You know, one of the things to think about with this chart here is, and this whole presentation is, I'm not going to talk a lot about sour cocktails, about cocktails with citrus in them. It's not my wheelhouse. You know, and I think as we've progressed through these presentations, you've been talking a lot about botanicals. And so I think this is kind of that culmination of combining botanicals. But if you have questions about sour cocktails, Danny's here, and Danny's a wizard at them. So yeah, no-lets. Yeah, no-lets, I would call that an intense floral herbal. Danny, would you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, for sure. I was just going to say I put it in the floral kind of subcategory of London Dry Gin. It's made by the same people that make Kettle One vodka. It's the no-let family. Yeah, it's a relative like last 10 years, but not like a classic London Dry Gin. It came into the market about 10 years ago. Yeah, super floral. Wouldn't disagree with anything that Jake said. Don't have much to add there.
Well, you've probably worked with it a lot more than I have. So, all right. So, the chart before this gave us a lot of different ways of thinking about taste. But I think let's take a moment to talk about the process of tasting. And I think it's the most important when we talk about botanical spirits. The Wine and Spirits Education Trust is the foremost wine and spirits education organization in the world. And their spirit side, although a little bit younger than the wine side, really has been at the forefront of standardizing and making more rigorous the way people talk about spirits and talk about tasting spirits. And one of the things that they always will do is hammer into you that you have to taste spirits diluted. That diluting a distilled spirit reveals its flaws, reveals its complexities. In my opinion, also, when you're tasting spirits to evaluate them for mixing, tasting them diluted will reveal how they'll show through in a cocktail. The most important ingredient in any cocktail is water. And so tasting things with a bit of water really helps. We talked about this in the fruit episode 4. We talked about fruit liqueurs, where heavily diluting a fruit liqueur will give you a sense of how it will show through in a cocktail where it's only a small part. But I think in the world of tasting gin, the process of tasting gin, I think diluting about 50-50 like WSET teaches is about right. So I'm going to demonstrate here real quick. I have a bottle of Hayman's London Dry Gin. I have a glass. This is a tulip glass. It's not an INAO glass, but it's close enough. I'm going to pour some in there. Now, assessing gin for appearance isn't all that interesting unless the gin is highly flawed. I've been very fortunate not to taste very many flawed gins in my life. Pat or Brett or Dan or Danny, do you want to talk about what a flawed clear spirit might look like?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know, Pat or Brett, if you want to go first.
No, go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I mean, well, flawed in appearance. I mean,
Yeah.
Flawed in appearance just means that there was a filtration issue, which means that the expectation, especially with gin and vodka, is that something is going to be crystal clear, unless it's been indicated that it's aged or a couple of other styles. So it's mostly murky and cloudy. And in some cases, people will find it off-putting if it's overly oily, which you can see sort of a lot of oily grip on the side of a glass.
Yeah.
I mean,
Danny?
that would be what we would look for.
Sure. Danny, any other thoughts?
No, that covers it.
Yeah. What you don't get here, like you might get in other types of clear spirits, and Dan, you want to weigh in the brandy world, things like ropiness or other kind of weirdo stuff like that. Dan, do you want to talk about flaws in other cleared spirit appearance flaws in other cleared spirits?
The only other classic flaw is when the spirit is brought down from high proof to moderate proof, you can get some reactions between the botanicals and the water, and you still can saponify a botanical spirit. So you can get this very funny aroma that you'll find sometimes. Honestly, not as much because you don't have as much fat in botanical spirits, but some are, quite robust. And that's one of the only other ones I can think of.
Yeah, and certainly non-neutral based Genever you can get that.
Well, and it would luge, right? I mean, there would be enough in there that if you don't water, I mean, you could cause it to luge if you don't water correctly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or luge. Sorry.
Luge. So it turns kind of milky in color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's my glass of Hayman's London Dry. I'm gonna smell it. I've had Hayman's London Dry many times, so it smells how I expect. Nose, I would say though, when you're assessing for mixing, nose of the neat spirit is way less important than nose of the dilute spirit. So I'm going to go ahead and dilute around about 50-50. And the nose gets darker. The orangey notes that are on the nose when it's neat, I feel kind of blend out a bit and it gets a bit darker. And dark is something I use to describe Hayman's London Dry a lot. And then tasting, I think the thing, again, this characteristic of darkness, and we're going to talk more about what juniper tastes like in a moment, but when you taste something, when you taste a gin diluted 50-50, you get a couple of benefits. One, you get a sense of what things you can build around it. And today. We'll talk about some of that. The other thing is you're going to get what it tastes like in a no vermouth martini. So if it tastes good to you, really good to you, diluted, then maybe you just want to drink it on the rocks sometimes. So one of the things we love about Heyman's London Dry is it works great with a lot of vermouth and it works great with no vermouth at all. So anywho. So what does juniper taste like? So here's the what might be the gong for some of y'all. People get, I find so many people out in the world when I'm talking about gin who get so caught up of, well, I don't like the Christmas tree scent. Well, you know, juniper is a berry. It comes from an evergreen bush, which certainly the bush itself smells piney, and sometimes the berries might smell piney. They might have some resins from the tree on them or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But when you macerate them in alcohol and distill them, distillation selects aromatics, and a lot of the piney characteristics that you might get out of juniper are bitter and heavy and don't necessarily come over a still all that well. So I was at the Heyman's distillery in November of 2019, and the distiller there was trying to assess different suppliers of juniper berries. And so he had made some juniper only distillates. And so I was tasting through them with him, 3 or 4 different ones, and the marketing guy was there too. And what I found in all of these distillates was that the primary characteristic that came out, especially in dilution, was a dark, rich, oily characteristic. And it really created this numbing, almost numbing character on the middle back of my tongue, much like we talked about when we talked about assessing aromatized wines for tongue mapping, this numbing, oily character. And it started to really make all the sense in the world to me when it came to thinking about traditional gin, juniper forward gin. That dark richness would have been, in the beginning, people bought gin because they wanted the juniper for reasons we're not allowed to talk about because we can't talk about medical effects of alcohol. But that characteristic would have been prized by customers because they wanted that juniper. But so there are gins that taste piney. There are traditional juniper forward gins that have a piney element to them. But when you taste diluted, don't be looking for that when you're thinking juniper. Look for this darkness or the dark, oily, rich character. Some people even call it a dry spice character. Middle back of the tongue. So to take the previous eye chart and turn it into a flowchart eye chart, here's a way of taking a gin and trying to assess it for what style to put it in, because the label can be deceiving. The term London Dry Gin really just means it really is just defined by gin folks as all the botanicals being distilled together. It doesn't have to be made in London. It doesn't have to be dry, and it doesn't have to be juniper forward. We're going to use London Dry here as a shorthand for a juniper forward gin of normal strength, but it doesn't have to be that way just because it says so on the label. So dilute and taste. If you taste and feel that juniper, and I think really you feel juniper on the palate as much as you taste it, then you're going to go down the left side. If it's sweetened with sugar, then that's going to fall in the world of Old Tom. And Danny's done this, so he knows exactly what it's like to find the right amount of sugar to put in an Old Tom. If it's not sweetened, if it's high strength, that's going to be a Navy style gin, and we'll talk about what a real Navy gin is versus just something that happens to be at high strength later on. If it's got a firmness to it, if it's got an intensity to it, in texture, even in dilution, it's probably more of a London Dry style gin. If it's more delicate in dilution, it's probably more of a Plymouth style gin, because Plymouth style gins don't have some of the bitter is sort of the wrong word, but that's the word that's used, bitter type of aromatics in their botanical bills. Now, if you don't have this juniper gin or other flavors come out, often herbal or floral flavors, or in some cases citrus and anise, then you've got a modern gin. Firm here, I don't want to use the word astringent because that might be considered a flaw, even though it's certainly not a flaw for certain types of mixing. But I like to break down modern gins in terms of, are they really tactile on the palate, or are they more delicate and creamy? So some of those that are tactile on the palate are tactile because of wood tannin, and if they're brown, then they're probably a wooded gin. So there's a lot of other words that you could use instead of delicate and intense here, but those are ones that seem to work for me. And if it says Aquavit on the label, it's probably Aquavit. The market for Aquavit is very much a traditionalist market. So if you had something that had, juniper and cacao and raspberries and stuff, and you called it Aquavit, then people would laugh at you.
Well, it's kind of relevant because Chicago is probably the south border for where you would sell a lot of Aquavit, actually.
Yeah.
Because we do okay, and as you get further north and west of here, Wisconsin, Minnesota specifically, and Scandinavian populations, you obviously see a lot more Aquavit.
And I'm sure nobody from Wisconsin drives across the border to shop at Benny's.
Yeah.
Never.
Never in Gurnee, certainly.
So, so this is another one you might want to go back to on the YouTube if you're tasting a gin. This is kind of an eye chart. I understand that. Now, this is the tongue map. Coming back to episode 3, talked about it a little bit, summarized it a little bit earlier in terms of how flavor stimuli hit different parts of the tongue and balancing drinks that way. I've circled here the styles of spirits that we're going to be working with tonight, and then in italics, I've got the types of aromatized wines we're going to be talking about tonight. Again, I know nothing about sour drinks. All sour cocktail questions go to Danny. But I also know that I really like when a spirit and an aromatized wine work great, just a glug and a glug in a glass with ice. And I think in quarantine time, while it is fun to stir up a drink, sometimes you just want to have a mixture that tastes great. So you're gonna see this chart a lot as we go through, as we talk about different combinations. All right. So Hayman's London Dry. We're going to talk about Hayman's London Dry before we talk about Hayman's, so if those of you have it at home, get it in a glass and try it. The Hayman, this is an old recipe. The Haymans have been making gin since 1863. Now, dry gin really wasn't a thing back in 1863, but this is a gin the Haymans made before they created a little gin you might have heard of called Beefeater. And this is meant to really build up that oiliness of juniper and support it with other botanicals that create texture. Orange peel and orris root. Orris root is, gin distillers often call orris root a fixative, if you will, something that allows other flavors or botanicals to get set. And juniper and orange are two that really get set well by orris. Orris creates that structure. In the world of gin for cocktails, dry gin for cocktails, a London dry gin that you're going to use for a lot of different drinks has to be very versatile. It's got to work well in low dilution drinks like simple stirred drinks, or high dilution drinks like a French 75 or something with a sparkling wine. It's got to work well in aromatic drinks. It's got to work well in sour drinks. So it's got to have texture and something other than citrus to really show through in a sour drink. But it's also got to have botanical oomph to show well in stirred drinks. If a dry gin is herbaceous, it's probably not going to work that well with vermouth because vermouth is herbaceous. So, and you don't want those things to clash. And I think Hayman's London Dry is a really great example of this kind of gin. It's 47% alcohol, so it's got plenty of punch to take dilution. And if you do get a chance to taste it using the method we've talked about, I think you'll find that it works great in a no vermouth martini, but also works great with a lot of vermouth, such as. So again, a quick look at the tongue map. The Hayman's gins we're going to talk about tonight are all juniper-y gins. So they're all going to be kind of middle back of the tongue, at least as I look at my own tongue map. And so for me, vermouth, herbaceous, tip of the tongue. This is a great example of spreading flavors across the palate to create a mixture that is very harmonious. So we're going to match Hayman's gins with different vermouths. And with Hayman's London Dry, I think this is the classic for the dry martini, which means dry vermouth. That's what's in my glass, which is equal parts Hayman's London Dry and Dolan Dry. So this is about as classic as it gets. And so a classic dry martini, gin, dry vermouth, orange bitters. remember, folks, that the dry martini was called the dry martini because it was made with dry vermouth, not because it was made with no vermouth. Now, sadly, the modern parlance is very, very different, but fight for tradition, at least this tradition.
Am I a complete Philistine for not realizing that martinis normally have bitters in them?
Danny?
Yeah, I don't know that I would call you Philistine, but yeah, the martinis, since I started studying them, they always had, well, I don't know. I mean,
I'm not a martini drinker, to be fair.
yeah, the dash of orange bitters is pretty traditional, but that's not to say that, like Jake was alluding to, with people not realizing what dry martini means. Obviously, the recipe has gotten messed with a lot, and when people started asking for just like a whiff of vermouth or rinsing the glass with vermouth, I guarantee you they weren't adding a dash of orange bitters in there. I think it was just gin predominantly, and then like a splash of vermouth. So it makes sense that the bitters would have fallen by the wayside.
Yeah,
because we talked, did any of that have anything to do with the connection, which is probably very tenuous, with the Martinez, and part of what is sometimes attributed to be the precursor of the martini was the Martinez from San Francisco, which would have been a bathtub gin and sweet vermouth?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer, I think, might be better presented when we get to the Old Tom and talk about the Martinez.
Take that, Brett.
But the
teaser, okay.
Don't worry, it's almost there. But yeah, I mean, and the other thought was that bitters, and in this case, stomach bitters, would have been part of any cocktail, capital C cocktail. And even though vermouth has its own bitterness, generally it would have generally been accepted that some other bitters would have been used in something that would have been called a cocktail. What I find is the way I always put it to people is if you start making martinis with Dolan Dry, you learn very quickly that a martini is a cocktail with orange bitters in it, because it really does bring everything together. I make no, I am certainly not a whiz at finding the right bitters for every cocktail, but this one has worked well. Other orange bitters also available, but we love our friends Nick and Ira and their company Bitter Cube. Now a little bit about Heyman's. I'll try to get through this relatively quickly, but they are a very important old producer of gin. They're the oldest family gin producer in London. 1863, they started on Cale Street in Chelsea. Their current facility is in Balham, just south of Clapham in South London, kind of the next hip new neighborhood. They are the original distillers of one very iconic London gin. That would be Beefeater. They owned it until relatively recently, when Christopher Heyman, the fourth generation, sold it on to a company called Whitbread Brewery. It's then got sold on, and it's now owned by a French company, Pernod Ricard. All of Heyman's gins are made with the same 10 botanicals, but in different proportions. There's no funny business here. No flowers, no vegetables, all classic gin botanicals, including orris and licorice, which were great for texture. The other thing Heyman's does is, and this goes back to the very beginning of their gin production, is they macerate the botanicals in the English wheat spirit for a full 24 hours. That allows the flavors to kind of come together. You get a full extraction. You get the darker, deeper notes extracted as well. And those are the ones that come over the still and create that extra texture that every Heyman's gin has. And last, what they make are traditional styles of gin. London Dry gin, Old Tom gin that's properly spiced forward and sweetened, slow gin where you can actually taste the gin. We talked about that in episode 4, the fruit episode. And then a 57% alcohol gin that's not just a Navy strength gin, but a gin that was actually supplied to the Navy. Here's the family. On the left is Chris. He's the 4th generation, and then Miranda and James are the 5th generation. These guys are here. They are an English London family, still doing it the old way, and that's their still Marjorie behind them. They name all their stills. and distilled in London, right off the tube in Balham. There's an old Gin Palace pub right at the end of the street that they're on, that of course serves Hayman's gin. But you can see some of the botanicals here as well. Orris root down at the left, angelica root next, sit on the right, orange peel, etc. So 2 types of cinnamon. They're big cinnamon fans, both Ceylon cinnamon, or what we think of as stick cinnamon, and then cassia bark, which is a common spice in Chinese cooking, especially. Now, the first gin that Hayman's really made a splash with in the US is their Old Tom. Old Tom gin is a really important drink in the early history of gin cocktails, before dry gin became a thing, before neutral spirit was high enough in quality that dry gin could really be a thing. So this is a gin. It's lightly sweetened. It's not wooded. It is what English Old Tom gins were in the time of cocktails.
There's a very common Old Tom gin that we sell that is wooded in color. They're kind of going off the reservation on their own thing with that traditionally then, right?
Yeah, that's a Dave Wondrich thing. But yeah, it's a long story. I consider it not traditional, just like Jake would as well.
Okay.
You consider talking about the ransom, I'm assuming?
Ransom Old Tom, like tasty gin, but it is wooded though. And do they add sweetener to it still then, or they just rely on the sweetness from the wood?
No, it's just the wood.
Just,
the thing is like the story is, I remember reading it from David, and he published an article in the Daily Beast a couple 3 years ago, kind of disavowing some of this, but was that these gins would have been shipped in cask, and so they would take on color from the cask. Well, I don't know if Pat or Brett, you have a bottle of Lafroig 10-year-old or something like that handy, but the casks that were used for shipping would have been so inert that they wouldn't have imparted hardly any character to the gin. And I always think about Lafroig 10-year-old, which is almost colorless. That spent 10 years in a cask that would have been considered too useful for maturing spirits to ship gin in.
Yeah, and it's a lighter color than the Ransom Old Tom.
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's a very American thing to put things in wood. Tad is a wonderful distiller who makes wonderful products, but Ransom Old Tom, when I think about mixing with Ransom Old Tom, I think about it much more like mixing with it as a wooded gin or as a wood forward product rather than as a botanical forward product.
Mm-hmm.
More on that in a moment. And again, this is another great gin, even though this is only 41.4% alcohol, it's another one that dilutes really, really well. And that's really important for Old Tom drinks, because what is possibly the most important Old Tom cocktail is the Tom Collins. There's a sour. Hey, I talked about a sour drink, which is really just lemon juice and soda and maybe a little bit of simple to balance. But that's a drink that's a highly diluted drink. But of course, in Old Stirred drink, Jake's going to talk about the Martinez. I have played around with Hayman's Old Tom and many red vermouths in the Martinez, and for me, Coqui Vermouth di Torino brings enough of the wine character, the Moscato wine character, to really show beautifully in a Martinez. And so, a classic spec, Old Tom gin, Vermouth di Torino, Maraschino, and orange bitters. Now, Maraschino was, if you go back in the era of the Martinez leading into the the dry martini, Maraschino was often employed as a cocktail seasoning. Maraschino was another thing that was considered a stomach thing. It was distilled from bitter cherry pits, and you see it show up in all kinds of things, whether that's improved cocktails, even in early specs for the Manhattan. So it's not surprising to see it show up in the Martinez, but then the orange bitters also show up there, and that sort of starts to build that bridge over to the Martini. So that's the short answer, Brett.
Very nice. Well, I just like the rough and tumble, 49ers, not the football team, but the people that were like sacrificing their families' lives for gold, who wanted something to drink in hotels in San Francisco. And then it came east, like all things, and was refined. It's a very romantic story.
Danny, when you serve a Martinez, what story do you tell?
Well, I don't know how much of a story I have different from what Brett said, but I can tell you how we build it, what our exact specs are.
Sure.
Scofflaw group, if that's interesting to anyone.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, no, in fact, we have one of the things we're talking about. We have a taste of the Scofflaw Old Tom with us right now.
That's right. Coming soon.
All right. So yeah, obviously before Scofflaw Old Tom was around, we of course were using Heyman's Old Tom Gin and all of the Old Tom cocktails. We would do 1.5 ounces Old Tom Gin. We would do 3/4 of an ounce of Carpano Antica, or Carpano Antica, as I guess it's supposed to be pronounced. We would do, at first we were doing like 1/2 ounce of Maraschino, but then over time it has become a skinny 1/2 ounce, so a little bit less, and then a dash of orange bitters. Actually, our orange bitters are like a house blend, so we take Fee's orange bitters and Reagan's orange bitters, and we blend them together in equal parts, and that's kind of our house orange bitters.
Yeah, that's a great way of doing it.
Yeah.
I suppose that much Maraschino you need to kind of counteract the vanilla and the Carpano, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
keep some definition.
like I think that's kind of like just how I first had it, so I have like an attachment to it, I guess.
Yeah, because when I make them, I just use a bar spoon of Maraschino.
Yeah.
But I like gin and wine, so.
Yeah, fair enough.
So Danny, before you these bullet points are from Pat's notes on Scofflaw Old Tom. Sadly, I haven't tasted it in years, but since you actually made the stuff, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, well, Sonia and Derek are the creators, really. They're the ones who make it, but we helped, come up with the right recipe. There were many different versions. They would bring it by Scofflaw in 2012. We would sit at table 9, kind of the big round booth in the center of the room, and we tasted different iterations and tried it in 2 different classic Old Tom cocktails. One being the Tom Collins you already mentioned, and the other being another cocktail we just spoke about, the Martinez. So we would kind of make each iteration in those 2 cocktails, and then that it was after tasting them on their own. And the version that we settled on, I think what we wanted was to create something that had like a noticeable floral component. Obviously, we felt that Heyman's was super delicious, and we enjoyed that as is. Heyman's was a little bit of a lower proof than what we were aiming for in our application. So we wanted, at first we were trying to go like 100 proof, and Sonia and Derek were like, just doesn't really taste right going that high. And so we kind of brought the proof down to 90 proof, so 45% ABV. There are osmanthus blossoms in this gin. It is the one kind of non-traditional component. We think it is pretty subtle. I don't think it's super overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree.
To make it its own product. Definitely you have that kind of orange peel and anise and juniper. Definitely a little bit sweet, rich on the palate. Yeah, and we enjoy it. It's funny. I think the reason I was, triggered by the Ransom Old Tom Gin conversation or, mention is that so many people are convinced that that's the way that it's supposed to be. And, I think it's a cool product. I also very much have no issues with that or anything like that. But it's just funny that people think that it's supposed to be aged and it's supposed to be a darker color. And
you're 100% though. We had that same issue because I believe we had it on the shelves before we had Heyman's, or at least we sold a bit more of it before we started selling the Heyman's Old Tom. And you're right. Spent a lot of time trying to explain why the 10-year-old product from Oregon was not, in fact, more traditional than the 120-year-old product from London.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then kind of another interesting thing to note about the Old Tom category, and maybe Jake was going to talk about this later, but initially Old Tom Gin was more of like a liqueur. It was very low ABV, and it was so sweet because, as Jake referenced, like the distillation techniques were so poor that in order to make something palatable, they had to add tons and tons of sugar. So what kind of started off as more of a liqueur became this kind of Old Tom spirit.
That's a really great point. In fact, Heyman's make a product called 1820 that is a cordial gin, and it's meant to sort of mimic that old classic style. In fact, I think they just call it cordial gin now rather than 1820. We don't bring it into the States because that's a tricky category to play with in the States, but it is a very important historic thing, and the name 1820 sort of captures that. Now, I will find, and I think Pat will agree with me, that while the anise and floral characteristics do provide an accent to Scofflaw Old Tom, that they don't push it over into that modern side of the leisure at all. And so Pat did sort of emphasize to me that he found it quite a bit sweeter feeling than Heyman's Old Tom. And so I thought, why not go with a slightly drier sweet vermouth? And Camo's, we talked about Camo's in episode 1. Camo's is the Blanc vermouth that used to be Dolan's biggest competitor back in the day. It's now owned by Dolan, but it's notably drier than Dolan Blanc. Still a sweet white vermouth, but it's also a bit more bitter. So I think something that really captures a lot of the classic idea of Blanc vermouth for mixing, but something that might also be able to deal with a bit of sugar in the gin. And I think since Camo's real heyday market back in the day was Cuba, I think a thrown martini, 50-50 Scofflaw and Camo's would be a heck of a good drink.
Sounds excellent.
Yeah. All right. And then this is one I sort of thought of, I find generally that gins that work well with Camo's also work well with Solaire's. Solaire's the gentian liqueur that has a base of gentian redistillate. So this is what I love about working with Solaire's and Blanc vermouth in all cocktails is you can make drinks that look like a glass of water and taste like $1 million. And this is one that a mixture that I think would work very, very well. For me, this would be equal parts and be finished with a grapefruit peel because that'll help rein in some of the bitter characters. So can't say that I've had this mixture, but this cocktail, but I suspect it would work all right. I know Danny's a Solaire's fan, so sorry to give you a homework assignment, Danny. You can change the name.
Would a garnish be appropriate on that?
Grapefruit peel.
It's a grapefruit peel.
There we go.
Yeah. All right. So Royal Dock, darling of tiki bars all over Chicago. The key point here is, yes, this is a Navy strength gin. It's 57%. It's strong enough that if you soak gunpowder with it, the powder will still light. All of that. But the real thing to think about this is actually a Navy gin. At the Royal Dock at Deptford, just east of central London on the Thames, this was the gin that was provisioned to officers' messes on board ship. So the point being is, this is a gin that had to be built from the ground up to taste good at high strength, and licorice root is really what provides that. When you add a lot of licorice root into a botanical bill, you get a ton of texture back. You get esters that come over the still that create this great sensation of sweetness across the palate. And then that way you can balance that. Of course, the juniper provides its own richness as well. And then you can really dial in the balance of drier characteristics, and angelica and coriander provide some of that to really firm it up and give you that sense that you're drinking an intense gin. Classically, this is a gin and tonic gin. Obviously, if you look at the tongue map, you might think more of a modern gin to go with tonic, and that's very much a characteristic of the modern gin trade. And then a lot of folks like its strength for drinks like the Saturn or the Singapore Sling, the gin tiki drinks. But for me here, this is still a gin that wants vermouth, but because it is so high in strength, it wants a bit of sugar as well. And so I go for Dolan Rouge with this. This is actually my father's favorite martini, is Heyman's Royal Dock and Dolan Rouge. It's one of those guys that you don't think is going to work, and then when you taste it, it feels like they just mesh together really, really well. Remember, Dolan Rouge is a little extra herbaceous and a little less sweet, and so it allows the texture of the Royal Dock the full character of the Royal Dock to still show through, but they're providing just enough sweetness to deal with the alcohol. And we like to employ that in what we call the house Negroni, which is about the driest Negroni you'll ever drink. But the wine texture, the Cappelletti, and the acid of the Cappelletti helps really provide that bitterness and drying character that you want in a Negroni. But this is a fabulous Negroni, and really shows off that intensity of the Royal Dock without making a drink that blows you away. So yeah, we love Heyman's London Dry and Negronis, but if you hold our feet to the fire, this is the one that we really want. So all of
you
these
would be, I mean, just as getting back to citrus, so we're talking the other thing, and maybe specific to that sort of intensity and the pepperiness, strikes me that this would also be something good to a lot. It's very popular now to order Negronis with mezcal instead of gin.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking that the Hammond's, in particular, the Royal Dock, might be appropriate to go the other direction and mix with citrus, or mix with typical margarita ingredients to make a gin margarita.
Yeah, it's not just the booziness that's why tiki bars love Royal Dock. It's because it has that backbone, even more so than the London Dry does. The first menu at 3 dots and a dash when it opened had a Saturn, and a Saturn is, the Singapore Sling is the most famous gin tiki drink. The Saturn is probably the best gin tiki drink. And they went through 5 cases a week of Royal Dock just making Saturns. So I don't remember all the things that are in it. Danny, do you remember everything that's in a Saturn?
Yeah, so a Saturn is London Dry style gin typically, or we can go with a Navy strength gin here. Lemon, passion fruit, and orgeat.
Yeah, so actually relatively simple.
Yeah, so 4 ingredients.
And that's like a passion fruit cordial type thing, Danny?
Yeah, so there's passion fruit by itself, passion fruit syrup, and then orgeat, which is kind of like an almond syrup, more or less.
And and Brett and Pat, you guys sell at least one passion fruit cordial, right? Like maybe the small hand,
we've got
small hand food one.
We have Passoa.
Okay, that's a liqueur. But I mean, do you sell any passion fruit syrups?
Yes, we just Liquid Alchemist. Liquid Alchemist is probably the one we're selling the most of right now.
Gotcha. Cool. So yeah, these are things that you can buy at Binny's.
Yeah, that one, Liquid Alchemist, has just come in. And BG Reynolds, they were in the market. They've dropped out of the market, unfortunately. So we have not had them. And then Four Hands, who's around.
Yeah. And now we pause for a moment for a bit of Celine Dion.
Oh, Jesus.
I would love to just sit and talk about traditional gin all night, because I like traditional gin cocktails. But obviously, in the last 15 years, the gin world has exploded with all kinds of really delicious things that are made, that are distilled botanical things that maybe don't just have this rumbling base of this dark oily juniper deal. They're still really delicious. You can make all kinds of cocktails with them, but maybe you don't want to mix them with vermouth. And so we're going to talk about a few of those, or in fact, Pat's going to talk about a few of those, or Pat and his crew.
If anyone's left here to listen after you pull that out.
At least I didn't sing it.
All right, the Dead Kennedys gin is coming up.
Yeah, right. We're going to start talking about probably my favorite modern gin, Pat.
Yeah, very popular gin. New one from the Beam Suntory family. What, last year or the year before now, Brett, I think? Yeah, not 2020, 2019.
Almost, actually, close to 3 years ago now.
Wow. So I think this is a very soft gin, but it's arguably, I think, one of the most approachable, because for a lot of people, like Jake, you mentioned earlier, piney gin. This is not that at all. A little lower proof. It's very fragrant and perfumed, but it's not like old school perfumey like some older school London gins can get. You know, it's floral and it's got a nice citrus backbone that's a little riper and I think less dry in character. It's just a really easy gin. It's an easy drinking.
Yeah,
approach.
the sakura flower really comes into play, I think. That
Mhm.
was the first thing that I got over it, was that really floral, almost mouth coating floral character, which has got to be the flower in the tea.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, it's more the tea than the sakura. I think the sakura creates a beautiful kind of side note, but it's the combination of teas in this just it's so beautifully done. And you know, you're looking for a gin to drink on the rocks. I mean, I love Heyman's London Dry on the rocks. I love Heyman's Old Tom on the rocks, but this is one that's just a beautiful drink on the rocks. And it
Mhm.
has that characteristic in a very different way than the Heyman's gins do, but when you dilute it, it grows in the glass. And that's something that a lot of modern gins don't do. And those are, you know, when you dilute something and it gets more intense or more rich, or it draws you in more, those are gins you want to go off and make cocktails with. And so for me, you know, certainly a floral gin with the sakura, and the tea comes off quite floral as well. So I'm gonna stick that on the middle front of my tongue and then try to find something in the back. Now, tonic water, quinine, you know, there's a reason why tonic water goes great with all these modern gins. Many of them are made to go with tonic, because if you go to Europe, especially if you go to Spain, which is gin crazy, 95 to 99% of gin is drunk with tonic. So if your gin isn't good with tonic, then you don't have a business. So, you know, yes, I love traditional gin and tonic, but a lot of these things work really well with a lot of these gins work really well with tonic. For me, though, I saw another thing with quinine in it, which is quinquina. And what quinquinas bring is this element of wine, whether that's acid or fruit or texture or side botanicals. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But for something like Roku, which has this incredible balance and intricacy to it, I wanted to mix it with something that also has a great deal of balance and intricacy, and then an extra hit of acidity, which I think frames the delicate elements in Roku really well. So that's Cap Corse Mate Blanc, Quinquina from Corsica, made with Vermentino and Muscat grapes, high acid because it's from Corsica. And then it has its own very special citrus, which is Cedrat, which is a very thick-skinned, kind of looks like a big ugly lemon, but has this real great fragrance, which will play in with the various fragrances of the gin. This is a wonderful mixture. You could do Cochi Americano Bianco as well, but I don't think Roku needs that much sugar thrown at it. We'll talk more about mixing with Americano Bianco in a moment. But these two, just half and half in a glass with some ice. You can make it July any month of the year.
Glug glug in a glass.
Glug glug in a glass. All right, now something a little more out there. Pat?
Finn's, yeah. Finn's from Chicago Distilling. This is a favorite of Brett's. Of course, we start talking about it when he walks away.
Sorry,
yeah.
guys. Wait. What did I miss? I was gone for only the last 30 seconds.
Talk about Finn's Gin. Go, basically.
Finn's Gin was one that we sort of were talking about different things to do in the modern style, and we know we picked Roku because of the floral character and that, and we picked Finn's because it is of that style that is citrus forward, which I think, especially judging ADI and ACSA, we see tons and tons and tons of from craft producers. But with that other layer to give it a little bit more complexity that has, again, that peppery character,
Darker
and
spice.
anise, and I would almost talk like a little bit of like true, like not like the drier cinnamon, not the sweet round canela, but more of a cinnamon stick sort of thing. So Danny, what do you do with Finn's?
That's a great question. For me, it's like a huge, I'm pretty sure it's like a big cardamom. Is it the cardamom or coriander? But it, like for one of those two things for me really stand out with the Finn's gin. We definitely, the first time we had like a house gin and tonic, I'm pretty sure we used Finn's, especially over at Sink Swim. Yeah, I mean, definitely enjoy it in refreshing citrus forward cocktails. It makes sense given the citrus forward profile. Yeah, I don't necessarily have like a specific cocktail that comes to mind. But yeah, obviously really love Jay and Noel.
It's a good all-rounder. I find it has a bit of an anisey finish to it, even though it's so citrus up front. But you know, it's very much a modern gin in the citrus character, in my opinion.
Yeah. And citric gins can be all over the map. I find there's a lot of folks who make gins that are trying to go after the sort of London Dry versatile gin slot that are very citrusy, and I don't find that those work all that well in sour drinks because they'll bring other things to the party. But I think here, if this is a gin that's a very showy gin tonic, I suspect that it is cardamom, Danny, because you look at a lot of gins in Europe that get a lot of favor in showy gin and tonics in those big fishbowl glasses. It's often cardamom heavy gins, but definitely, Pat. I did not get a chance to taste this, but Pat really brought out in his tasting note the more kind of dry and kind of tactile character on the finish. And so I thought maybe this is one to throw a little more sugar at. So herbal floral gin, again, a frontish gin, even though it is a bit citrusy as well. And so I thought something with a little more sweetness, an Americano might work. And the Americani that we work with also have quinine in them. So they also spread that botanical impact across the palate. And so Finn's Gin, Cochi Americano, Bianco might play around with the proportions here. This might be more of a 3-2 rather than a 1-1. But I think with enough dilution, pretty much any proportion would work pretty well. Again, and this mixture, of all the mixtures that we're talking about today, this is the mixture that you could turn into a sour cocktail the easiest, for sure. Maybe even like a Corpse Survivor #2 type drink. So, all right. And now all the way up in Evanston, our friends at Few do a wooded gin. Pat, I know you love this one.
Yeah, well, this is one that Brett and I always use when we're doing staff trainings, because I think at the early end of the American craft boom, we saw a lot of wooded gin because everybody thought they needed something brown in color in a bottle to sell. And not all gins are created equally as far as like wood barrel aging goes. It's not as simple as just throwing your London Dry gin in a barrel for 4 months and then saying, oh, I have this beautiful wood aged gin. Whereas the Few was specifically designed to be aged in wood barrels. They changed their botanicals. I think they even changed the mash bill up on it a bit to get it totally in line where it was going to show best when it saw this time in ex-bourbon barrels. And so I find it, just a little more balanced, and it's just, for me, it's one of those barrel aged gins that, you just taste it side by side with some others and it really stands out.
Yeah. Danny, do you want to talk about this category? I mean, I have some very specific thoughts on wooded gin, but you've seen many customers and tasted many wooded gins. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the category as well as on this gin.
Yeah, so when we first opened Scofflaw, there were a small handful. You had the Citadel Reserve, you had the Journeyman Bilberry Black Hearts Barrel Aged Gin, which is, I love that product, but it is not like this product in that the Journeyman one is so barrel-y and the notes are almost overwhelming and almost smells like coconut and dill and more like a rum. Whereas this gin definitely maintains its gin character through the barrel aging process, which is pretty impressive. But yes, the category is big. It's definitely a good gateway style of gin for whiskey drinkers or for aged spirit drinkers. And I think that's kind of why we've seen it explode. Also, it's another way to make your gin more distinctive. And as we know, pretty much every flavor combination has been tried in the gin by this point. But yeah, I mean, I think, I guess if I could speak generally, I would say that people enjoy drinking barrel-aged gins more by themselves, like on ice or just neat. Whereas for me, the other styles of gins, the ones that are not barrel-aged, I prefer to mix with.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the theme that runs through what both you and Pat are saying is that when you play around with a barrel-aged gin, either making it or mixing with it, you have to own the wood.
Mhm.
But the wood, especially when you chill it and dilute it, which is what you're doing when you make a cocktail, the wood is going to come out because the wood is a texture. And so even when flavors are deadened, the texture stays. The wood has lignins or wood tannins that come out. And so that's certainly the characteristic that I think about when I think about wooded gins. And this is a wonderful wooded gin, but it's certainly one that when you mix with it, you want to play with the wood. So again, this is one wood, as we talked about when we introduced the tongue map, wood, especially wood that is only used for a few months, is going to hit you right on the tip of the tongue and really create a tactile character. So I wanted to find something with quinquina, find a quinquina to go with it. You can go different ways on sugar levels. We'll talk about that in a moment. But a bit of a caramel character always helps frame wood, almost provides a varnish for the wood, much like the caramel and red vermouth does in a Manhattan. And so I sort of thought of two different things at two different sweetness levels. A little bit sweeter, maybe a little more classical would be Bonal. Bonal, I always think of Bonal as umami for stirred drinks. And I think few barrel and Bonal work really well together at equal parts. But something that I found has worked with a lot of what I like to call lightly wooded spirits, whether those are brandies aged in older barrels, especially apple brandies, or barrel aged gins, is Cap Corse Mété Rouge, which has it has a lot of different bitternesses on the back of the tongue, so it really spreads out flavor across the palate in a mixture. And so a cocktail that I sort of think about with the Few Barrel is something that, given Few being at Evanston, we'll call it the higher education highball. But equal parts Few Barrel and Mété Rouge, just lengthen with soda water, and you can go crazy. You can really lengthen it. These are both products that are highly dilutable in the sort of sense that we talked about. Again, I think I'd go for a grapefruit peel here, though maybe a lemon peel would work as well. But this is a type of drink that can work with a lot of different kinds of light brown spirits, but I think works particularly well with the Few Barrel. Mété Rouge is a pretty intense fella, and it's even though it's sort of brownish and you think it might be something for a bourbon or rye, it's generally a lot of these other sort of wooded spirits that it really shows with the best.
Yeah, and we had a question from Lawrence: is dark gin, is all dark gin from wood barrels? And I would say, yeah, to the best of my knowledge, outside of slow gin, which is obviously coming from the addition of liqueurs. If you're talking about that color gin, that I would say would be a yes. And then really quickly on the spot, and I think Danny kicked in and out. Danny, are you back?
What?
Danny, you're there. So we did have a question. We're going to put you guys on the spot as a transition. From Blossom wants to know, on the spot, we need to know if we can somebody needs to make up a Sakatini on the spot that we will portray in honor of Jen Psaki, our new White House Press Secretary.
Yeah.
So quick, we need a Sakatini.
Yeah, I mean, what are sake and the Sakatini or what?
Yeah, sake, you got to use sake.
I mean, I think, yeah, go ahead, Danny. I have some thoughts, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, to stick with like the floral characters, I mean, Jake had earlier mentioned that, I mean, different philosophies here, of course, but for me, with the Sakatini, it would be nice to use something like Koki Americano and maybe something like Solaris to dry it out. So I don't know. I mean, something like.
So you're using sake as the base?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm only, I didn't know I was allowed to use gin. Am I allowed to also use?
I mean,
yeah, of course.
I was going to talk
there was
about
a lot of rules laid down in this challenge. Right. I would just say some words that would sound palatable, and then we can move on.
Well, no, it's a market.
There's
It's
lots
a
of
marketing concept.
Here.
It's a marketing concept looking for a product.
I think it'd be cool to do like, yeah, I mean, maybe like 1.5 ounces of a London dry gin. Again, if you want to stick with like the floral notes, depending on the sake, I mean,
sake, yeah. Yeah, the sake part is the hard part.
I mean, I would do like 1.5 ounces of like a London dry gin, and then kind of a 1/2 ounce of sake, 1/2 ounce Kogi Americano, 1/2 ounce of Solaris, and then call it a day.
Yeah,
that'd be my sakatini.
So
yeah, well, you need
drink it.
to be honest. You need to be honest, straightforward. You need to have a sense of humor, and you need to be, firm and in control.
So I will admit I am a Jen Psaki fan. She was a State Department press secretary, and State Department. If you ever watch a State Department briefing, you have to answer the weirdest, most obscure questions from the correspondent from Outer Elbonia every day. So you really have to have a love of everything about the world to brief at the State Department. And so I think I would get the Roku out, and then I would go find a Yamaha type sake, something that has a lot of lactic acid, a lot of real robust earthiness to it, maybe even one that has some a lower sake meter value, maybe even a negative one, and then just a little wee bit of that Cap Corse Mété Blanc just to add some acidity. That would be my thing, but it's that's the hard part is the hard part, and the happy part about this conversation is how much more amazing sake there is in the States than there has been ever through the efforts of folks like Monica Samuels and Tona Palomino there in Chicago, and plenty of other great folks. So, although, if you've got to give it maybe even a Nama sake, because you got to give it back, you got to give it back pretty raw to our press friends. So. All right, one last thing, and this was a request of Dr. Brophy, to talk about Aquavit. So now Danny, at Scofflaw, would you guys embrace Aquavit like you did gin, or?
Like, would we become a Aquavit based cocktail bar instead of a gin?
No, just like, did you celebrate it? Do you celebrate it at Scofflaw like you do gin?
Yeah, I mean, we enjoy it. It's, again, I think the market dictates how much we would use it. So it's still a relatively small portion of the population who comes in with a taste for it. But yeah, of course, I have no issues with it. I enjoy it.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
I love Aquavit with food. I've been very fortunate to travel to Denmark and drink Aquavit with food, and that's a lot of fun with smoked fish or other sort of funny vinegary things. Gamla Ode, which is made in Wisconsin, is not a Danish style Aquavit, and for more, here's Pat.
Well, it's a Swedish style Aquavit. So Danish style Aquavits tend to be caraway heavy, whereas their Swedish neighbors go all in on the dill. So if anybody's tasting this at home, this is dill, and more dill. It's got a bit of a caraway background to it, though. But unlike Norse Aquavits, they're not usually aged, whereas Norwegian Aquavits normally you see are aged. Linje would be the big brand, LINIE, that at least we sell across pretty much all binnies at this point, right, Brett?
Yeah.
We kind of lump Aquavit in with gin when we're doing staff trainings, really because it's gin of a different type. It's non-juniper forward, but at the same time, you've added botanicals to a neutral spirit, and it's originally was drank as a digestive aid. So I think they kind of have a shared ancestry of it in that sense. As far as cocktails go, I know it's getting used more as like a savory element in some cocktails. Traditionally, as Jake said, this is purely a bottle is kept chilled, and it is thrown back a shot after a really rich, heavy meal. Cured fish is obviously a big one up there, but rich celebratory holiday meals and stuff too. So
Sure.
I think this is quite good. The 45th Parallel Distillery in Wisconsin has been cranking out some really outstanding products recently.
And if I
just
understand,
Aquavit, some really great whiskeys too. So,
and if I understand correctly, this product they have a very short window, like about 48 hours, because they try to source dill that they're getting from that's relatively local, and they're ready to distill. And when the dill's ready, they bring the dill in mass, and that's all they do for up to 48 hours is just run through whatever dill they have, and then they're done for the year.
Yeah, they do an aged version of this that's kind of like a celebratory Christmas version too. That is really outstanding, and is our Whiskey Hotline counterpart Joe Maloney's like favorite drink ever is this aged dill heavy Aquavit that he fell in love with a couple of years ago.
Awesome. What are the whiskeys that come out of 45th Parallel, Pat?
Well, they do New Richmond Rye. They do a bourbon. They also make bourbon.
W Wheat.
Yeah, they make the bourbon for J. Henry and Sons, actually. That's distilled there. Their whiskeys, their rye, especially some of the best rye I had over the past couple of years was a cask strength rye from New Richmond.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good to know.
The Wisconsin wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for me, dill, Aquavit is built around these sort of astringent anisey type things. Caraway is more earthy than any of the anises, but star anise, or in this case dill, are both in the anise world. And anisey things tend to be, for my palate at least, it kind of looped in on the middle front, kind of where Peychaud bitters is as well, etc. And so again, this is where Americano, also having quinine in it, helps spread flavors across the palate. Now, I will admit that one of my favorite people to talk cocktail theory with is a fellow from Oregon named Jacob Greer, who is a huge Aquavit fan. And with him, one night we had a bottle of Coqui Rosa, and we started mixing it with he had like 30 Aquavits. We started mixing it with a bunch of Aquavits, and it turns out that it works with all of them. And so, and one of them was Gamla Otis, so I can vouch for this mixture personally as well. The Coqui Rosa, you get this great richness and fruit from the base wine. You get the bitter botanicals that balance out the flavor, the bitter expression across the palate, and then there's something sort of mystical about it as well. And so the drink that we came up with, which we now refer to as the Greer and Now, after this fellow's last name. I sometimes call it the fundamental theorem of Aquavit, though, is equal parts Aquavit and Coqui Rosa and a couple of dashes of Peychaud bitters, just to make it pinker. And it's a killer one. It's worked with every Aquavit I've tried it with. And again, equal parts strengths are great, both for burning through bottles, but also for not worrying about it too much when it gets to the end of the day.
And now we know what to do with the other 7/8 of that bottle of Aquavit we bought to figure out what Aquavit tasted like.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Oh, but Aquavit is almost unique in its ability to stand up to foods, or to go with foods that almost nothing else does, like high vinegar, super smoky. I mean, sometimes you can think of pairing a beer or something, but it's Aquavit is a perfect.
Well,
perfect
Blossom said gravlax, but you're right. The vinegary, think pickled herring.
All the weird jars of stuff Brett keeps in the office.
Yeah. All the weird.
These guys don't like it because I like to have a jar of pickled herring around. Dan agrees.
Kimchi. It would go with kimchi, actually. Yeah.
And it goes with kimchi too, which I have. It's no Russ and Daughters, but I mean, what is?
What Brett's not telling you is that Pickled Herring is the name of his next band.
Correct.
So if you want to make a pink drink that doesn't taste like a pink drink, this is a great pink drink to make. So just to conclude, and for those of you watching on YouTube later on, this is a good way to come back and kind of remember. We talked about a lot of different botanical things tonight, a lot of different types of botanical spirits, a few modifiers. There's a few other modifiers on here as well. This is, this tongue map comes from my personal tasting. Other folks might group things in another way, but I hope through the explorations we've done tonight, you get a sense of at least what we're thinking about when we're trying to take a new botanical spirit, whether it's a modern gin, a traditional gin, or an Aquavit, and find the right aromatized wine to make a simple cocktail with it. So you can refer back to this anytime you want. For more information, Binny's, of course, Binny's website is great. You can find this episode as well as all the others on their YouTube channel. We also have full social media. Our Instagram is where we have the most information. And then Heyman's Gin also with a full set of stuff. When travel becomes a thing again, and if you're going to London and you want to go visit Heyman's, they have a wonderful little visitor area. The stills right there, and that great Gin Palace pub right down at the end of the street. So
let's Danny, real quick, because and probably everybody that's listening to this lives somewhere, because everything has been closed down, especially on premise has been very severely affected with all of our friends. Danny, because I know you're doing something really cool right now. Can you let us know what's going on with Scofflaw currently?
Yeah, so currently at Scofflaw, we're doing a food pop-up called Chin Up Buttercup. And then at our other places, the Moonlighter is still open. Outside Voices, which is kind of our natural wine bar, still open. Slippery Slope and Heavy Feather obviously closed down for the time being, but we're optimistic that they'll come back, hopefully, in summertime. And Scofflaw will probably be back, I would say, at April in some capacity. But yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing.
Because I wanted to say specifically, because I had dinner with Monique, our mutual friend Monique from Winebow the other day, and she was talking about Chin Up Buttercup, and it's awesome. So if you are anywhere remotely close or have the ability to get to the border of Humboldt Park and Logan Square, which is where Scofflaw is at the corner of Armitage and Kedzie, I would highly recommend, if you want some comfort and want some comfort food, you guys, I will heartily endorse what you guys are doing with Chin Up Buttercup. It's awesome.
We're available on DoorDash and Grubhub as well. It's called Chin Up Buttercup.
Awesome.
Well, Danny, thanks a lot for joining us, man. I appreciate the insights into the Scofflaw Old Tom and gin cocktails in general. Obviously, since I didn't even know there were bitters in a martini, I wasn't the qualified one to talk about this today. So, Jake, thanks again for joining us. Dan, too. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and listening today. This has been fun. Like Jake mentioned, the other ones are back on the YouTube channel. They might be on the Binny's blog. So we'll see how that goes. Yep. And we'll be back soon doing some other stuff.
We're going to tease a little bit. We're having a discussion in one of our panelists here. We are putting together our next series of some indeterminate length is going to be American brandy. And everything American brandy. So keep an eye on the Binny's website for future details or further details about when that starts and what we're going to cover. Obviously, our feature guest is going to be one of the oldest producers of American brandy, who is sitting with us right now, Dan Farber at Osacalis.
He's not that old.
I'm talking about the age of the distillery. The age of the distillery, not the age of the distillery, not the age of the distiller.
But we'll be back with Jake too. I think we're going to do something similar with this to whiskey at some point. I think kind of demystifying which sweet vermouth may or may not go with which of your various proof bourbon, I think would be a fun thing to do. So if you're down with that and you want to see it, send us a note at spirits@binnies.com. You got any other questions like that, just spirits@binnies.com goes right to Brett and I, and we'll let you know what's up. So until next week, I guess, everybody, cheers. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Danny and Jake and Dan. All right, guys.
Thanks,
cheers, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Cheers. Take care, guys.
All right, bye.
Bye.